Yeah, well, first of all, thank you to all our speakers today. Before I open the floor up to questions, I just wanted to maybe reflect a little bit on the three excellent talks we heard here today, and maybe start lastly with Maximilian's points about maybe in particular what is close to me right now is the increased nationalism and xenophobia in Europe. When yesterday my adoptive country of Denmark, where every fifth person voted for the Danish People's Party, and how that maybe links to what you were saying about sort of indifference about the importance of liberal democracy, and Jon's comments about illiberal democracy in the Russian context. Because, and this is just a speculation, I can imagine Russians who would say, look, this is what democracy also brings. Like, you just have to deal with the consequences of democracy, but democracy is not always, a good thing. And perhaps the engineered elections that we see in Russia, where the Russian phrasing is so wonderful, you have vыборы без выбора, which just means elections without choice, but everybody participates in this sort of political theater, and that's the type of democracy that seems to work for a lot of Russians, whether we call it illiberal or we call it managed or sovereign democracy. We've heard a lot of definitions over the past 25 years. And I found it extremely interesting to listen to Sergei Medvedev's sort of overview of the post-Soviet period. And I found myself, when you were talking about the 1990s and you talked about how you did not feel humiliated at all, I wrote down in my notebook, but did you feel disappointed? And then you came out with the sort of 25 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, that now is this feeling of sadness and disappointment for where this experiment, this post-Soviet sort of period of, and I agree with you, like a period of hope, a period of sort of things are changing, everything's possible, the entrepreneurship is sort of making things possible for, I would say some not necessarily ordinary people, also people with some privilege in society. But my look at the 1990s, I would still say that some of the tendencies that you're talking about with, and I really liked the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that everything that Putin has, propagated for is sort of becoming true. But already in 1998, when the economy collapsed in Russia felt this sort of shock of isolation, nobody coming to back them up. I remember that being maybe a little bit of a psychological shock for the Russian population at the time. And I really also liked the sort of when you talk about the psychosis, the military psychosis, and people celebrating 12th of June with kids' prams dressed up in tanks. And then I thought about what Jón was saying in terms of the official language and how important what an important skill it is in Russia to be able to read and sort of decipher the media. And I really don't want to be the person who advocates for this sort of lack of agency, but do you think maybe you're also overestimating this, capacity of the Russian people? Because there's also the argument that people internalize the official language and start to operate as sort of intellectual beings within the discourse, and they're not really capable of looking outside of it. I know this is a hugely debated field, and I'm not advocating for one side or the other, but these are just some of the thoughts that came to my mind while listening to these three talks. And I don't know if you want to comment or if we should take a couple of questions first and then move on. We have 15 minutes for some questions. So I'll take a couple of questions from the audience and then we can give the speaker some time. Please. Yes?
My name is Ingi Bjarnason. I don't know much about this, so I'm here pure interest to learn, and this comment about that the Russian public is very good to read in between the lines of media sounds like a good. It seems that they are maybe in some way smarter than Western public. So I thought that was a point of hope. But what worries me listening to you is, maybe you, Sergei, is that it seems that all the blame is put on this one man, and it just sounds so simple interpretation. I'm sure I'm not quite interpreting right, what you're saying, but at least in Western media, this is seems to be a common theme to put all the blame on this one man. And you talk about that you don't know, you don't understand your nation anymore. How does one go about read the thought of a nation? And it's nice to have some hope, for the future. So, what does the Russian nation have some dreams? Where do they want to go?
Well, I understand this is more or less a question to me. About Putin, I think it's a perennial, like sociologists always argue about structure and agency, which comes first. Is this like Tolstoy was writing War and Peace about it, Napoleon and War and Peace. So would have war happened, would have Borodino battle happened if Napoleon didn't have his small cold in the morning, and so on. Putin, in a sense, is a political genius. I think much of the change which happened is because he got in resonance, he got in tune with the big change of mood in the public. It's not, of course, his own phantasms. It's not, of course, his own dreams. The nation, as I mentioned, was... look, it's not that I don't know my nation. I don't recognize, I didn't expect, I knew that these currents, that the trends are in there, but I didn't expect them to resurface so sharply and so visibly in such a short time. Like, for instance, you probably haven't watched, but for the Russian observers, you would be familiar with films by Alexei Balabanov, a wonderful Russian filmmaker. I think he has made the key movies about Russia in the 1990s and in the 2000s. And he was making his films about the Russian subconsciousness, the Russian myths and archetypes. And back 15 years ago, his heroes were saying that, yes, we will revenge for Sevastopol. Ukraine, we thought this is some kind of the political trolling, right? We thought it's some kind of the epitage thing. He wanted to appear like a Russian fascist. But then 15 years after, it strikes back. It comes into reality. People still say, yes, we missed Sevastopol all these years. Sevastopol is finally Russian. So you see, it was in there, but we probably thought that it's some kind of the passing nature, that it's the residual post-imperial complex, the residual post-imperial nostalgia. But then what Putin did, he got in tune with this post-imperial nostalgia. He actualized this, and he made it his political base, his political legitimacy. Right? That's something which supports his power. And this is very powerful, right? It's like, excuse this comparison, I'm not making direct comparisons with Russia today and Germany 1920s, but 1930s. But let's look back. What is this? Is it like common German sentiment, or is it Hitler that made Germany the way it was in 1930s? It's a little bit philosophical debate. It's both. Because the Germans were also there. If you read Günter Grass, the tin drum, right? You look at suddenly the nation falling into infancy, right? For being for good 30 years like a nation of infants. Before the final collapse of the Second World War and then Nuremberg, which ensued. So if it were not for Hitler, would Germany have turned Nazist? We don't know. Probably yes and probably not. So it's both ways. So in Russia today, I think it's the objective trajectory of the nation. Maybe we have to go through this whole round of Putinism, of war with Ukraine, of confrontation with the West. It will be the last act of drama in the fall of the Russian Empire, right? That we have to live through this before finally coming to grips with the modern world, before finding ourselves as just another normal nation state, not as a nation that dreams itself, that conjures up itself as an empire, cannot think about itself outside the imperial context. So I don't know, maybe 100 years later, when historians will write history books, they'll say, okay, Russia had to go through this period of Putinism to finally come to grips with this post-imperial accommodation. Some needed in a harsher format, some in easier format. Like France had to go through the humiliation of Algiers and the exodus of Pied Noir to France, to come to grips with the loss of empire. Britain had to go through the Falkland episode, and with Maggie Thatcher and this whole thing to finally once again also to come to grips with the loss of empire. So it happens differently in various post-imperial nations, but I hope that the Ukraine episode will be the last rock on which the teeth of Russian imperialism will be broken, and that Russia will come back to normalcy, come back to normal world, and that this will be that's probably some historical logic in all this.
Can I ask a question? My name is Alexei Shatsky. I'm from Russian Embassy. I marked me, just to be honest, and but you told about the empire. The empire in which point of view? The empire in the philosophic point of view, or the empire it's a type of state? And another thing, you told a lot about the 90s. I remark about these times because I've been in Russia at that time, and I can remember very well that liberals, so-called liberasti, took the power that time, and Democrats, they called them Democrats, and the people called them another way, that's Corporates in Russia. And they took the power, and the head of the Democrats, Yegor Gaidar, said at that time that, these 15-18 millions of pensionists is a ballast for our country. What wasn't it the fascism? So 15-18 million people at best died out, just died out. And it was a very hard time that time. It was a rubbish time. It was a very rubbish time, and it was a very difficult time for the ordinary people, for only few men could manage to catch the money from the fallen Soviet Union at that time. And you say there was a time of opportunity for thieves. For the time of opportunity for thieves, not for the population. And I can remember this time it was a very, very sad, very difficult time for everyone, except some thieves that time. It's not that, I can agree with Jon that we have a liberal democracy. Illiberal because we don't accept the liberalism at that time of this, it's liberalism in Russia means Malthusianism. No thanks, no more. We had this in 10 years of this regime. No more, no thanks. If you want to have some experiment so please find another country for the experiments. We have the communist experiment in the Trotsky type and the Stalin type. And this liberal experiment in Yeltsin and Yegor Gaidar type, no thanks. Do you want experiment? Just find another country for experiments. And you as a historian should understand this politics, that history is a politics turned to the past. And if we do not recognize our history and try to preserve our history, so we will lose our future, we will lose our present. That's why the 70th anniversary of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, was celebrated in such way. And about the listening in reading between the lines and the Russian, for Russian, for Western truth-orientated media in Western countries. Could you say to me what the Western media said about Iraq chemical weapon in 2002, 2003, and what it was said about the Strauss-Kahn? Now it's another things, but every Western media said about it. But if somebody wanted to say another thing, it was just keep it inside.
We have only 3 minutes left, sorry, but I think we should give each of the panelists a chance to just comment in the end. Thank you. So Sergei.
Okay, thanks for wonderful revelation. History is politics turned into past. I note it down. Is it an official pronouncement? Or did you take it from where did you take it from? But which one? Can you give me a quote? Because that's a wonderful thing. I mean, that's a terrible pronouncement as a historian. History is memory. History is archives. History is fact turned into past. And that's precisely the corruption of history that is done by Putin regime, which is politics turned into past. And therefore, we have this awful debates about victory, about Second World War, because it is politicizing history. So thanks for revealing this. It's really, you couldn't have found a more appropriate quotation for this kind of corruption of history and memory, which has happened in today's Russia. Now as to the 90s, and sorry, I didn't interrupt you, let me respond. Now as to the 90s and the 2000s. Well, first, I don't know why you addressed all this criticism to me. I didn't label myself as Democrat, I didn't label myself as liberal. Indeed, I think that people who labeled themselves as Democrats and liberals were indeed direct heirs of the Soviet nomenclatura and the continuers of Soviet nomenclatura. Secondly, the ruling party today is the direct descendant, who is Putin after all? He is the Democrat of the 1990s, right? He was the aide of Anatoly Sobchak. Who are all the profiteers of Putin regime? What is the cooperative Ozero? Where did they come from? Not from this privatization of the 1990s? But I'll tell you the difference between the 1990s and today. Because today is 1990s magnified by 10 times. The theft of today. 1990s, they're like kindergarten. The same Koch, Chubais, all these people there. They were taken, their private gain was 5, maybe 10%. Today people are stealing 100% of the budget, right? So the kind of theft, the kind of the kind of decay, the social decay that is happening these days. Have you ever checked? I know maybe it's not the figures to be checked in the embassy in Iceland, but the number of hospitals that are closed down in Russia. The number of schools which are closed down in Russia. Have you checked the Russian budget, the way it looks today? How much is allocated for social expenditure? How much is allocated for war? It's a budget of genocide. The current authorities, not the 1990s, are doing the genocide of the Russian population. The average life expectancy, despite the 15 years of oil bonanza, the average life expectancy is going down. The entire social infrastructure is collapsing, is failing. So all this oil wealth of the last 15 years were wasted for Putin's buddies and for the theft of the state budget, for staging the war in Crimea, the war in Ukraine, for staging this worthless Olympics, for building the bridge to Crimea. This is not, 1990s compared to this theft is nothing. So that's what I have to say about the 1990s and today. I'm not, the biggest fan of the 1990s, but the kind of the misappropriation of budgetary fund. were just nothing compared with what's happening in today's Russia. So probably you'll have something to reply about, the truth in the Western media.
Well, do you? What's something?
I mean, I just maybe very briefly. I mean, one thing that I noticed in the discussion is that we don't actually clarify, or we seem to have some confusion about what we mean by liberal versus illiberal democracy versus market liberalization. I think they're very different things that we're talking about, and well, I guess we don't have actually the time to go into that. Maybe the one question about expectations that you should have towards democracy. I mean, where you said the question before. I mean, maybe this is what Russians would say. Well, this is what you have to expect when you get democracy. I think. I can't comment on that, but I can comment on the fact that, I mean, developments in East Germany, for instance, but I'm sure it also applies to a lot of other post-communist contexts, have very much to do with disenchantment with democratic development. Because, I mean, people have certain expectations when countries democratize, and they're very, in many cases, very difficult to fulfill. I mean, I guess most people in post-communist contexts, when they hear about democracy or when they discuss democracy as an ideal to strive for, they think most of all of things like freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, but maybe most importantly prosperity. And if you look at the East German context, that's just simply not what happened. And this is a very important aspect in why people become indifferent or even antagonistic towards democracy, because expectations are disappointed quite fundamentally. I mean, well, you expect that, life will be the same in East Germany as it has been in West Germany for the last 4 or 5 decades. Well, then all of a sudden you're faced with huge unemployment, 25% in certain regions, neo-Nazis and things like this. So, I mean, that's certainly a very important point to discuss.
We have this cycle of hope, disillusion, and disappointment.
Yeah.
Final words.
Yeah, well, about liberal democracy maybe first. What I have in mind is well, liberalism and democracy are not necessarily the same thing, and they can be different. You can talk about democracy as something different than liberalism and so on, but the way the kind of understanding I'm putting into liberalism, and maybe I should have said something more precise about this, is that liberalism imposes on democracy certain basic principles that have to do with rights, justice, and several other basic values. My suspicion is that if you want to get rid of liberalism, you will end up getting rid of democracy as well. So that, I think, is the challenge that illiberal democracies such as Russia, Hungary, maybe other countries face. The views you are expressing are precisely the same views that I was citing from Vsevolod Chaplin, the church hierarch who has repeatedly sort of tried to give the exposition of the new kind of governmental policies that he thinks should characterize Russia. He thinks he sees it in China, and he actually takes the Islamic states as a good example of spiritually inspired policies. So I think, as I said, even though a person like Chaplin is not someone who speaks governmental policy, he gives us a very good and very worrying, I think, sort of view of what is becoming the reigning policy in Russia. And maybe, I mean, I agree with Rosa and Sergei on the lack of ideology in a way, but still there is some movement towards something you could call a spiritual ideology and so on. And I mean, I hear people like Alexei and many others I know in Russia who are trying to conceptualize such a view on society. For me, it's extremely worrying, simply. And I would ask, I mean, if the communist experiment didn't work very well, we know that. Now we hear that the so-called liberal experiment of the 90s didn't work very well either. So now something is working very well. I don't really see it actually, but I think the facts that Sergei was citing, and things we can read in publications in Russia, luckily yet by many opponents of the Putin government, point to similar things: theft, bribery, corruption on a scale unprecedented, even in the worst Soviet times. So whatever we want to say about the past, I don't think we can settle on some bright picture of what's happening today. And just finally about truth-orientedness, I did not mean that the Western media speaks the truth. That would be very naive. What I meant was simply that there is a context of discussion about the media, which means that the lies that are produced by the media tend to evoke different kinds of discussion in the West rather than in the East. In Russia, the idea of free discussion in many people's minds is chaos and confusion, and this is because the media, I think the mainstream media, and this has also to do with the government, of course, is responsible for bringing a lot of assigned disinformation. Now, I mean, we could, I guess, argue about what that means for the rest of the day, but that's what I'm trying to say. I see oriented disinformation as very much part and parcel of what the mainstream Russian media is about today, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much, Jón. I think that this discussion could continue, and it perhaps can here afterwards. I think that we've seen very clearly also now in the discussion that if the historian may speak, Russia is still searching for its place in the world. It really is trying to identify where it fits and what it should be, and that will continue probably for a long time. But I think my role here is over, so thank you very much. I don't know if Jón wants to conclude, or I think I'll conclude. So thank you very much for coming. Thanks to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.